was working on my book Media Virus, and I was about to return home to LA from San Francisco when Timothy Leary, of all people, he called and asked if I could make room for a friend in need who needed a ride. It's like, okay, great, I'll go, and gave me the address where to go and find this person. And that friend turned out to be Genesis P-Orridge. And I had known of Jen, through his music and reputation, but I was honestly a little bit afraid to meet him because I knew about the Temple of Psychic Youth, and I had met a lot of these boys who called themselves coyotes. And if they were modeling themselves after him, I could only imagine how fierce Genesis would be. But when I pulled into this little parking garage where we were supposed to meet, and I saw the diminutive Genesis P-Orridge standing there with his two gorgeous young daughters, and they had all their little suitcases with them, my perception of him just changed entirely. And over the next 8 hours, we took the long route, I guess, from San Francisco to LA. My perception of the world changed really forever as well. Jen had just been sort of exiled from England after a video he made for Channel 4 in which he carried out the mock abortion of a woman, then ate the fetus with a bunch of kind of devil-worshipping people. It went viral in the tabloids. And Jen was in Thailand at the time doing like soup kitchens and research for all his kind of weirder spiritual stuff. And the British authorities, they ransacked his place. They seized his archives, and they made it really clear in a phone call that he was no longer welcome in the UK. So he flew to California instead, essentially as a homeless person with his kids. And he was pretty out of sorts as we took this drive down to LA for him to try to figure out a new life strategy with Timothy Leary. And his two daughters were fighting in the back seat. And I remember him saying, it's right on tape somewhere, he said, oh, if only people realized I was just a regular dad with two kids fighting in the back seat. And the rest of what he said, though, was not like some typical dad. It was like listening to the tweets of QAnon. We talked about the child pedophilia ring controlling the world. I mean, it turned out to be right, I guess. And the way that the powerful word of, O-V, for ovum, that it was changed to of, O-F. And the value of taking too much psychedelics, because as he would say, the only good trip is a bad trip. And he would talk about how piercing and scarification are an extension of Brian Geison's cut-up technique. I mean, this was like weird, like two guys on a bonding road trip, but not just for the way it broke open my brain, but for the way it really broke open my heart. If anything made Genesis P-Orridge scary, it wasn't the machismo or Satanism or risk-taking, but his openness, his honesty, his tenderness. Yes, he did scary things like piercing his scrotum or getting gold teeth and summoning demons and becoming a they. But the scariest part of all was his staying so soft and squishy and loving, the little loving Jen through all of it. And I remember in the late 90s, I guess, we decided to write a book together about everything. And we made about, I'd done maybe 5 hours of tapes of our conversations over the years, but we holed up in this little country cabin. It was a really strange thing, him and all of his kind of weird outfits and piercings and stuff we're in this tiny little country cabin in upstate New York, and we're going to make more tapes. And Jen had this new thing, this compact disc recorder. I don't know if any of you remember those things. It was sort of on the way to digital. And we recorded maybe 10 hours of material in all states of consciousness. But when he got home, he called me and he was so upset. He said none of them had recorded properly, or he had gone over them repeatedly. He just didn't do the right thing. And it was the moment he decided that digital was not a good thing, because even though digital is supposed to remember everything, digital also forgets the stuff that you really want to save. And we did all sorts of projects together. I eventually got to help him reconceive Psychic TV as PTV3. And I even went on tour with him as really right along the same time that that he became a she and then a they. And I got to watch and participate from safe behind him and a full set of keyboards as he showed his brand new set of breasts to a crowd of very confused, mostly male devotees. And they were all still wearing those macho sort of paramilitary outfits from one of Jen's prior incarnations. And these guys were shocked, right? Was their hero softening? And over the course of that evening, I watched Jen break them down. And I really think they came to understand that he was daring them to break their not just of gender, but of courage and of autonomy. Yes, I still call him a he at that point because, when I asked him at that point, I said, well, do you kind of see yourself now as a chick with a dick? And he said, no, more man with tits. And he saw himself as a guy still at that point. But of course, Jen ultimately turned out to be neither and both. He became what he called a pandrogyne, breaking sexual binaries altogether and attempting to revolt not just against the prejudices of our society, but the authority of DNA itself. He said that DNA is an alien virus. That's what they would say, that it turned previously immortal creatures into separate genders limited by death. In Genesis, he embarked on this pandrogyne experiment with his partner, Lady J, originally Miss Jackie, who was a dominatrix who worked at this dungeon on Lexington and 23rd. And I remember the day that Jen met her, he actually asked me to come meet him up there. I went up to the dungeon. I was in the waiting room and he came out and he showed me these two big slices that she had gouged in his chest with a razor. And he smiled to me and he said, oh, she gets it. Or maybe it was like, she gets me. And they got married like a year later. And Jen and Jackie were really among the two friends my wife Barbara and I could just go to dinner and be totally normal with. They would often present her with a little mod skirt or a tiny sweater they found at a vintage store and they just thought would be perfect. And they would have these fights, long drawn out fights, not like in front of us, but like themselves, but over like weeks where Jen would just get fed up, usually because she was doing too much of the wrong drugs or something and become convinced that their relationship was over and he'd come stay on my futon for a few days at a time. Just imagine having little Genesis Peorage staying on your futon. It was so intense, but so sweet. And, eventually they always worked through whatever it was. And from the moment they embarked on the Pandrogyny project for real, they were genuinely like this one being. They weren't talking about changing genders so much as becoming a complete gender together. And that's why when the great Lady J suddenly died, Jen was so broken. It must have been, 10, 15 years ago at this point. It's terrible enough to lose a wife and a life partner, but they just spent the last decade merging life, art, love, gender, and self with Lady J. There was no he or she. There was only they. Jen lost half of themselves. And we spent many weeks, maybe months, looking at whether breaking sex should become breaking death. Jen was convinced for a long while that he could still communicate with her on the other side, and that maybe the project was finally reaching its true fruition, that she was still pushing certain pictures off the wall and certain books off the shelf, and Jen was inferring the meanings and coincidences of it all. And we considered the possibility that they might not only cut and paste pictures and music and culture and gender, but they could cut and paste life and death, break the illusion of the other side altogether, liberate from the tyranny of DNA, and that this would be the big one. But as time went on, the visitations from Jackie became less frequent and I guess less convincing. Jen returned to music and poetry, now as a single they. And there were new girlfriends, even a new true love, about whom Jen couldn't help but share all the steamy details. It was like being in high school or something. But as Jen got sick with leukemia and more limited in what they could do, shows got canceled, things got genuinely scary. I mean, Jen started on a book about their life, told through encounters they had with everyone from Mick Jones to William Burroughs. Maybe we can, I'm hoping, get some of the finished chapters online or in a different kind of collection. They were good. I'm glad I didn't accept any of the invitations to write Jen's obituary. There were many Jens, and I think that's part of the point, to try to write an authoritative obituary of Jen kind of defeats that point. By the late 90s, as the terrible future of digital surveillance became obvious to anyone who cared to notice, Jen explained to me and to everyone, really, that anomalous behavior would become our only defense. And Jen may have been the greatest enactor of anomaly in our lifetime, but no matter how much Genesis Briar Peorage mutated over the decades, so I was supposed to be doing a talk this week at South by Southwest. I mean, guess what? Yeah, it was canceled along with the rest of America, it feels like, and the world. It was going to be about fake news. That's what they wanted me to talk about. And in a kind of a glib nod to Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, I was going to call it How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Fake News. Because like that montage of atomic bomb images at the end of the movie, the images on our TV screens, they're not the real things we should be worried about. They're the distractions, the figures. They are the designated photographic threats capable of garnering ratings or standing in for an enemy and conforming to the needs of television as a medium and as an industry. And just like that 3D representation of the coronavirus, with which we're all now so familiar, the way it's complemented by custom logos and scary theme songs on each one of the cable networks, it's real news. The virus is certainly real. But is it the real story? Is television capable of serving up the deeper, contextual, or applicably relevant truth at all? And, the point I was hoping to make in my talk was that the preponderance of fake news and deep fakes online could just restore the primacy of trusted news agencies and journalists. That the less we can trust the veracity of videos, the more we have to depend on those whose very responsibility it is to determine the provenance and context of things. And this isn't new. And this is as old as the public needing a real reporter to verify the facts behind a story. And if anything, the more accustomed we become to the idea that video pictures have no more claim to truth than something we read or hear, then the